and welcome to a cover story conversation. I have with me Ambassador SHYAM SARAN. He's the former Foreign Secretary. He's also been an ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and Nepal. And he's authored two very interesting books. One is How India Sees the World, and the other is How China Sees India and the Rest of the World. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, Ambassador. Thank you too.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Priya.
Good to have you here. I've been reading your columns very avidly and been trying to get you for a while, so I'm glad I finally got you. Couple of things today I want to raise with you. First of all, we are talking soon after Prime Minister's visit to the US, his meeting at the Quad, and of course the address in the UN. The other thing I want to talk to you is something which you write very often in your columns, that we must first, secure ourselves neighborhood first before we look for a larger global role. And at the moment, India is poised very interestingly with a lot of there's been a lot of change in the neighborhood, whether Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal also has a Prime Minister Oli back again, Pakistan, of course, Maldives. So, and it's also somewhat hostile situation for us. So how are we negotiating it? So that's all we have on the table today. But first, let's begin with his US meeting. How do you see the Prime Minister's visit to the US, the meeting at the Quad?
Well, there are two aspects to the visit. One is, of course, bilateral, and the other is, the summit of the quadrilateral, which, by the way, was delayed because India was supposed to host it earlier during the year. But Biden could not come, neither for the Quad summit, which was scheduled, nor for the bilateral visit. There was news that he might be the chief guest at our Republic Day. So I think this is probably a delayed, holding of the summit. And, India has been gracious in the sense that it has allowed, President Biden to have this farewell kind of a summit before he demits office. And I think there are important agreements that have been arrived at under the Quad. So there is merit and there is some substance in India's view that the Quad is here to stay. So I think that's an important gain from this particular meeting. Bilaterally, important things have happened. Important because we have, taken forward the very strong cooperation that we have, for example, in the technological field. I was quite surprised to see the news that there will be a semiconductor unit being set up in India, which will be supplying chips, semiconductor chips, not only to the US military, but to the other Quad militaries as well. So that's a level of engagement and a level of integration, I would say, with the Western militaries and security systems, which is unprecedented. So that has, of course, an upside because it gives us access to very high technology. But, there is also a certain downside because there is a certain kind of, being caught in a particular kind of a system from which, if the geopolitical situation changes, it may be difficult for us to have some room for maneuver. So that's the downside. Important also agreement on counterterrorism. The Quad has extended the very strong cooperation that we have with the US on counterterrorism into a kind of a quadrilateral agreement. So these are substantive gains. So I would say both from the point of view of our bilateral relationship as well as from the perspective of the Quad, this has been a significant visit. Only rider that I would like to add at the end is that Biden is going to demit office. You are going to have a new president, in January next year. And whether or not all these positive trends can be taken forward, whether there will be even greater expansion in the bilateral relations, that is still a question mark.
No, in fact, that is another question I wanted to ask you about the impact of the US elections on India. I know by and large in geopolitics, it's the country that matters, not the individual. But having said that, would India benefit more from a Trump presidency or a Kamala Harris?
Again, there are pros and cons. With regard to Trump, you should also acknowledge that there is, in this government, there is a certain kind of a affinity with Trump, despite all the
wondering what word you would use.
Yeah. So I think the preference, unstated, in this government may be that having having Trump might be perhaps on balance a better proposition. But that does not take into account the fact that a Trump presidency may give you perhaps a greater pass on some of the domestic issues that have arisen, human rights, communal issues. But there will be unpredictability and uncertainty with respect to many other aspects of bilateral relations. He has already said that India is not a very friendly country as far as economic and commercial issues are concerned. So will there be a greater, tariff on Indian exports to the United States, which, by the way, are doing rather well? Secondly, there will also be the collateral impact on India as a result of global uncertainty of a Trump presidency. So what will he do with respect to the Ukraine war? What will be his attitude with respect to NATO? He has not been a great, a great champion of NATO. What will be the nature of the relationship which may evolve with Russia, for example? So these are all question marks whose collateral impact may, on balance, be negative for India, because we need a predictable, a supportive global environment for our own development. So there is that element. With regard to Kamala Harris, she is not yet an open book. But as a Democratic president, I think she will have to pay more attention to human rights issues of whether there is a democratic backsliding. These are issues which will also crop up. Will she continue with the same team as Biden has? Very important whether Sullivan and Blinken continue in their current positions, because that is what is going to give a certain degree of continuity to the India-US relationship. But again, I would like to emphasize at the end that now, as I mentioned before, the level of engagement with the United States is so broad-ranging and deep that even if there are changes, whether in India or in US, these very strong kind of linkages which have been built up over the last 20 years or so since the Indo-US nuclear deal, I think this will probably give a certain stability to the relationship, which would be all to our advantage.
Okay. Just before I come to our neighborhood, I have one more question about how Prime Minister Modi is in this third term. He's been giving a lot of impetus to foreign policy. His first trip, interestingly, was to Russia. He's been criticized or praised for it. In terms of how he's handling the Russia-Ukraine equation, how we balancing the two forces, and India does see itself as a peacemaker. How does the world see us as that?
Let us first acknowledge that today we are living in a very highly polarized international environment. This level of polarization we have not seen for quite some time. So when there is this kind of polarization, if a country is able to position itself as some kind of a bridge in that polarized kind of an environment, that on balance can be an advantage. So there will be criticism of India. Oh, you are also having a summit with the Russians, and you are also having a summit with Ukraine. There is a certain degree of hypocrisy involved in this. But I think on balance, India positioning itself somewhere in the center in this polarized atmosphere is perhaps a sound policy to follow. Because this gives you a certain kind of, a stature, which you otherwise would not have. Now, the situation with respect to Russia and Ukraine is so fraught, I think, where the confrontation is so deep. I'm not very certain whether any kind of mediation, whether it is by India or any other country, is likely to be very successful. But to the extent that you are able to encourage a degree of dialogue between the opposing parties, that's a plus point. You would have seen that the Prime Minister also met the PLO, the Palestinian Authority president in New York. So he's very consciously and deliberately trying to suggest that, India is not quite committed to one side or the other. It has a certain independent agency which can contribute to some degree of bridging between the opposing parties should such a kind of a situation arise. So from that point of view, I would say what he has been doing makes eminent sense, but we should not oversell this idea because the idea that somehow the other India has become the great friend for everybody. I think that's a bit exaggerated, but certainly I would say that this role which India has been trying to position itself in is makes sense from our current kind of international situation.
And his visiting Russia before he went to Ukraine, how do you see that? That's also sent its own signal to the US and China.
One thing we should recognize is that even though there has been a steady decline in India-Russia relations, inevitably, after the end of the Soviet Union, there are still very important legacy, relationships with Russia. For example, in the defense area, there is no doubt that still we are heavily dependent upon spares and components from Russia. And with respect to some areas, even though we have a very close relationship with the United States, we have not been able to get certain kinds of cutting-edge military technologies from the United States. That's a reality. Now, if you take, for example, India's nuclear submarine program, without the kind of support that we have had from the Russians, that program would not have gone forward as it has. So we have to, first of all, recognize that there are important substantive reasons why it makes sense for India to maintain a cordial and close relationship with Russia, irrespective of any other issues. The second is with regard to, how we take our relationship with Russia forward. I think there is an assumption in India, which may be not quite correct, that long-term China-Russia relations are not aligned. That, Russia, if it had the opportunity, it would like to distance itself somewhat from China. Why do I say that? Because if you take the area where Russia sees its greatest, sort of interests, it is Central Asia, right? The former Soviet Union republics and Eastern Europe, which was part and parcel of the old, Warsaw Bloc. Now, which is the country which is making the maximum inroads in these two areas? Not the West. It is actually China. So this cannot be a matter of great comfort for Russia. So there is a sense here. It is how I perceive this, that keeping our relationship with Russia on an even keel, keeping that cooperative relationship going, will in fact be helpful in terms of this longer term relationship with China. So we should not neglect that relationship. Lastly, I would, of course, like to qualify this by saying that there is also a sense today that maybe the Russia-China relationship has gone somewhat beyond, just the tactical level, and it is assuming a much larger kind of a profile than perhaps we may have anticipated. Now, whether that will lead to some adjustments in our foreign policy in the future remains to be seen. But I would just wanted to identify that as a possible trend.
Watch this space for that. I'm going to take a quick break and come back and continue this conversation. But now we're going to move closer and focus on our neighborhood. So stay with us. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation with Ambassador SHYAM SARAN. Ambassador, we spoke about India, US, China, but now I really want to focus on our immediate neighborhood. And I see you've been writing a lot about the changes in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So let's first begin with Sri Lanka, since they just had a new prime minister. How do you see the relationship evolving?
But they have a new president now. The prime minister
I'm sorry.
will
And yeah,
come,
that's
after the parliamentary
just a minute.
election. So there is a new president, and the importance of this election is that for the first time in Sri Lanka's history, you have a non-mainstream party leader who has been elected president. So that's something that we should recognize as representing a very important
Great.
departure from the past. So it cannot be just politics as usual with regard to Sri Lanka, not domestically, and perhaps even in foreign policy terms, there may be certain shifts which remain to be seen.
Domestically, how?
Domestically, because he has committed himself to fairly what one may call populist policies. He has said
Left leaning.
that he would like to renegotiate the terms and conditions of the IMF support to Sri Lanka, which my sense is that the IMF is not in a position to accept those kind of changes. If he is going to go, in terms of, providing support, financial support or other kinds of subsidies to the populations who are disadvantaged and who have been affected by the economic crisis, that will impose a huge fiscal burden. The reality is that Sri Lanka does not have that margin to make this kind of a policy successful. So if he really goes ahead with that, I anticipate that Sri Lanka may once again face a major economic crisis. So that is the domestic, likely scenario that we may see because of the ideological and political nature of this new dispensation. That is one. There could also be a revival of greater sort of, ultra-nationalism, because this is what the JVP, in the past has been associated with, and that ultra-nationalism has always been directed against India. So we should not take that as something that is inevitable, but we should keep that in mind. So this is the kind of situation that may arise. But I have also argued that we have now a fairly dense economic interdependence between the Indian economy and the Sri Lanka economy. Secondly, we have helped Sri Lanka, unlike China, with overcoming its immediate economic crisis. We came in very quickly with foreign exchange support, with the swap line. We provided rice, we provided fertilizers, we also provided fuel, petrol and diesel, which enabled Sri Lanka to overcome its economic crisis. And also on the debt which it owed to India, we were far more forthcoming in terms of restructuring the debt than, for example, China was. Right. So the last time I was in Sri Lanka, I had a very clear sense that the public sentiment towards India has very much improved compared to the past. So I'm hoping that that kind of economic interdependence, the importance of the transshipment trade between Sri Lanka and India. Colombo port depends upon that transshipment business. So my hope is that both the fact that India stood by Sri Lanka during the worst days of its crisis, second, because there is very close economic interdependence between the two countries, this will act as some kind of a stabilizing factor in the relationship. And I think Anura Dissanayaka has not made very negative statements about India. In fact, he has said that he would like to have close relations with India and that India can be a good support on the economic side. So those are positive signs, and let us hope that as we go forward, these will come into play. There is still question mark, because now there will be parliamentary elections. We don't know what will be the results of those parliamentary elections, who will be elected as or nominated as prime minister. So there is a certain merit in expressing goodwill for the new government. But waiting and watching to see how things develop. No need to jump to conclusions right at this point of time.
Okay. And you also wrote that at least we met this in like 2 years ago when he visited India. There was some, which has not happened in Bangladesh. We've kept there. We put all our eggs in one basket. So how do you see the change in Bangladesh and
Well,
how
it is,
India's?
my information is that it is not true that we did not have any, engagement with the opposition Bangladesh National Party, the BNP. Maybe we were seen certainly as far more committed to Sheikh Hasina than maintaining a more balanced relationship with other political forces. Don't forget that we could not possibly have much engagement with the Jamaat, given its
Mm,
history and its rabid kind of anti-Indian kind of approach.
correct.
Maybe we should have had more engagement than we actually had. But to say we did not have any engagement at all may not be quite accurate. Second, whatever may be the problems that Sheikh Hasina is now facing in Bangladesh, let
Mm,
us not ignore the fact that because of the long tenure that she had as prime minister, we were able to establish probably the best relationship we have had with perhaps any neighboring country in the last several years. You know, for example, today, connectivity with our northeast through Bangladesh is a reality, which the
okay.
previous regimes would never allow.
Mm,
The connectivity projects between the two countries have really advanced in a manner that many people had not anticipated. Certainly, I had not anticipated. The kind of cooperation that we were able to get from Bangladesh on the security side with respect to support which was coming before for several of the Northeast insurgent groups. That ended. So those are very substantial gains for India, which should
mm,
not just put aside and say, oh, we made a mistake, supporting her. Yes, we supported her, but we supported her because, under her, a number of very substantive gains were made by India. And there again, I come to the same conclusion that today, we have a network of economic and commercial relationships and
mm.
other of connectivity between the two countries, which I hope will provide a degree of stability to the relationship, even if there is a change in government. Now, I am perhaps a little disappointed that the meeting with Muhammad Yunus in New York with our prime minister did not come about. It would have been good if that kind of meeting had taken place. But I'm not quite sure why that meeting did not take place. But I think it makes sense for India to continue to show a degree of goodwill and a degree of patience with the new regime in Bangladesh. But
But
also, I would like to end by saying there are certain worrying trends in Bangladesh today, with regard to
the radical.
the kind of violence which we see again
Mm,
erupting on the streets. We see that the Jamaat is playing a much more prominent role than perhaps even the student leaders may have expected. Uh, we are not quite sure what the attitude of the army would be. The Bangladesh army is the one very disciplined, organized force. It has kept itself in the background. But if the situation really gets out of control, how will the army react? These are all question marks.
can the situation improve while we still have the hot potato? I mean, we do have the Sheikh Hasina here. So will is that being a deterrent in the
You
relationships
know,
improving?
I Number one, I think there will be immense reputational damage to India if
Mm,
India hands her back to the Bangladesh authorities, where it is possible she even may face execution. So, knowing the risk that will be entailed by her return to Bangladesh, I think it is not. It is, shall I say, we should not even
preempt.
consider that possibility that maybe we should just hand her over. Secondly,
Mm,
will handing her over
mm,
actually improve the relationship between India and Bangladesh?
yeah,
I
I
do
don't
not
think so.
think so, because this is not this touchstone of the relationship between the two countries. So I would hope that this will not emerge as a major issue. Of course, it is legitimate on the part of the current dispensation in Bangladesh, that she should generally keep a low profile, not too many public statements against the new government. So that is okay. I don't think she has been making any statements as far as I can see over the last several days. Even her son sitting in, the US has been.
US.
So I think the deal is that, you know, she will have refuge here, but she will not engage in active political activity. That's okay.
For now, thank you so much for a very comprehensive conversation. I think you managed to cover a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.